talk a little more generally, and I'm not really going to say much about climate change. My other panelists are going to talk more about climate change. I'm going to talk more generally about environmentalism and economism and try to put a spin on what the Trump administration is up to in regard to environmentalism. So as soon as that comes up. Okay, so I just want to start with some brief background on environmentalism, which probably doesn't need much, but the 1970s, we can certainly go back before the 1970s, but it's quite astounding if you take a look at this list behind me of the legislation that was passed in the United States in the 1970s regarding the environment. It's something that would probably never get passed today. But we had a number of important acts that were passed. And importantly, a lot of this was kicked off by the first Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970. And that really united a lot of people. There were a lot of people prior to that time that worked on separate issues like air pollution or wilderness preservation or energy issues that began to see themselves as environmentalists and see themselves as having something in common. We also have the creation of the EPA, which I'm not going to say anything about, in 1970, and importantly in 1970, if you look, the National Environmental Policy Act was passed, and this was important because it actually mandated citizen involvement in government decisions regarding the environment. We got environmental impact statements out of this, and it led later to citizens being able to litigate and lobby and act and work on behalf of the environment. Prior to this, there was not a lot of citizen involvement in government decisions. So this is the environmental decade. Jumping to the 1980s, these were the 10 biggest environmental groups in the 1980s. And if you'll note, 9 of the 10 are still around today. And when a lot of people think of environmentalism, they think of groups like this: the National Wildlife Federation, the National Audubon Society, the Sierra Club, the Wilderness Society, Friends of the Earth, so on and so forth. And these groups, again, all but the last one are still around today. The last one was actually merged into Friends of the Earth in 1989. I want to put in a plug for the environmental justice movement, which is another form of environmental activism, which often doesn't get talked about in regard to the environment. By the 1980s, there was a new form of environmentalism that had arrived on the scene, and this was a blending of social justice and environmental concerns. It was not led primarily by white men, which the traditional environmental movement was led by, but it was led primarily by people of color, women, blue-collar, labor, and marginalized peoples. And it tended, in contrast to the traditional environmental movement, which tended to focus on nature out there, like nature with wilderness, nature with endangered species, the environmental justice movement tended to focus a lot more on urban and rural environments. And the notion of what the environment was began to become redefined. These are some of the central issues of the original environmental justice movement, and they're all central issues today. If you take a look at this, the siting of facilities that produce toxic and hazardous materials and waste, environmental racism, occupational health and safety in the workplace, land rights, urban environmental politics, and struggles of indigenous peoples. And these are all environmental issues. And I wanted to bring this up because when a lot of people talk about environmental issues, they often miss the environmental justice movement and the fact that a lot of environmental issues are linked to social justice issues. Now let's jump to a little bit of philosophy with this. These are basic positions in environmental ethics, and what I want to suggest is that everybody has an environmental ethic, whether they're explicit about it or implicit about it. And I could have expanded this list, but these are some of the basic positions. They're all centrisms. So anthropocentrism are human-centered ethics, and most people who regard the environment morally tend to regard the environment in an anthropocentric way. There's nothing wrong with anthropocentrism. You can use traditional moral theories such as utilitarianism, virtue ethics, human rights, and the like in order to come up with an anthropocentric environmental ethic. A lot of people care about the environment in regard to future generations of people, and you can certainly construct an environmental ethic based on concern for future generations of people. You can also construct an environmental ethic, weirdly enough, using economics, which is exactly what Donald Trump has done, and I'll say more about that in a moment. You can also construct an environmental ethic based around animals, zoocentrism or zoology-centered ethics. This is animal-centered ethics, where you're regarding not just individual humans, but individual non-human animals as well. A lot of people, when they think about animal rights, they think about zoocentrism. Biocentrism is life-centered ethics. Biocentrism involves all living organisms, which includes plants and insects. So we expand the circle of what counts morally from just humans and anthropocentrism to humans and non-human animals and zoocentrism to all organisms, all living organisms, and biocentrism. Ecocentrism moves beyond the individualistic focus of these other positions and looks at the environment holistically by centering on ecologically centered entities such as ecosystems, species, communities, however you're going to slice up nature. So these are some of the basic positions in environmental ethics, and what I want to try to do is map out Donald Trump's basic position in environmental ethics. So Donald Trump, on January 23rd, he likes to use the word big a lot, said this. And he is big on the environment. Big on a lot of things. So, since Donald Trump has become president, he's issued a number of executive orders that affect the environment. And I just want to give you a flavor of what he's done since he took office. So these are all executive orders that Donald Trump issued. So on January 24th, he issued an order to expedite environmental reviews and approvals for high-priority infrastructure projects. This includes things like the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Keystone XL Pipeline, both controversial pipeline projects. On January 30th, he issued an executive order to reduce regulation and control regulatory costs. I love this one. Executive departments and agencies have to slash 2 regulations for every new regulation proposed. Regulation spending cannot exceed $0, and any costs associated with regulations must be offset with eliminations. So trying to eliminate environmental protection, environmental regulations, and other regulations. On February 24th, the executive order came out to enforce regulatory reform in agencies. Each agency has to designate one person as the regulatory reform officer, and who will be responsible for reviewing current regulations, making changes to or recommendations to agency heads on how to modify them. And you have to hone in, the RRO has to hone in on certain regulations, especially those that are considered to be outdated, whatever that means. And importantly, anything that affects job creation has to be reviewed. 2 more environmental executive orders are on February 28th, the Restore the Rule of Law, Federalism, and Economic Growth presidential executive order to review the waters of the U.S., which was President Obama's Clean Waters Rule, and it instructed the EPA and the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works to review this and propose a new rule that either eliminates the Clean Water Rule or revises Obama's water rule. And then on March 28th, the Promote Energy Independence and Economic Growth, which directs the EPA to review President Obama's Clean Power Plan and any regulations that could potentially burden the development of these kinds of resources, namely nuclear energy, coal, natural gas, and oil. So what I want to suggest with all of this is that Donald Trump has an environmental ethic, contrary to what many people might think. And that environmental ethic is best characterized as a position that philosophers like to call economism. And economism is using economics to make environmental decisions. It reduces most things on planet Earth to people and commodities. There's people and economic commodities. Everything has value for human use. It views protecting the environment and economic growth has a zero-sum game. So if you want to protect the environment, you're going to harm economic growth and you're going to harm jobs. If you want economic growth, if you want to protect jobs, you have to eliminate existing environmental protection. There's a zero-sum game going on there. It uses different forms of economics as the framework to make many, most, or all public policy and political decisions. So everything is reduced to economic cost-benefit analysis insofar as it affects economic growth. This is the framework you use to make your environmental decisions. It elevates economic and monetary values above all other values, such as cultural values, social values, political values, and moral values. And it elevates economics and economic growth above other ways of thinking about people, about the relationships between people, about the relationships between people and the environment. Everything becomes reduced to economics. So again, this extreme economic vision is there's only 2 basic kinds of things. There's people and there's commodities for human use, and everything that's not a person is a commodity. So this is what philosophers call economism, and it's centered on it's an ism centered on economics. The guiding framework for economism is what we might call free market environmentalism. And free market environmentalism, again, Donald Trump's environmentalism, the central tenets are that people are best motivated by money. So if you want to accomplish something, you have to provide monetary incentives. The proper role of the government is less government is better. It's very much a libertarian vision, minimalistic government. And government agencies are inefficient in managing natural resources. And the solution to environmental problems is actually market forces. Market forces do not cause environmental problems. Market forces solve environmental problems. So if you want to solve environmental problems, you want to marketize, if you will, the environment as much as possible. And because a lot of environmental problems are caused by an absence of clearly defined property rights, we should define everything in terms of property that we can. And here is a way to do that. This is kind of the vision of free market environmentalism. The solution to environmental problems is to privatize the environment as much as possible. And ideally, this would be selling off public lands to the highest bidder. And the motivation here is that if you own the land, you have an economic incentive to protect it. Now, that doesn't always work in practice. If you own the land, you might have an economic incentive to maximize value and actually overuse the land. But the idea is the people that are best prepared to take care of land are the people that own lands. We could also use various trading permits to commodify air and water resources. And we could even go to the level of species. If you care about endangered species, buy one. Don't merely rely on the government to try to protect them. And we could invest property rights in things like species. And if you can see this little picture right here, it's a McDonald's arch behind Yosemite Valley. And there's actually been a plan going back to the 1990s to actually have corporate sponsors for national parks. And so we could have McDonald's Yosemite National Park, for example. So I think this is the environmental vision that you get out of Donald Trump's administration and many Republicans today. Some possible problems with this are the following. I mean, and I put this up just to motivate some discussion about this. The first question is, can we put a monetary value on everything? Is everything reduced to money? Are there some things that are priceless? Are there some things that don't fit into an economics framework? The second problem is it might be a category mistake. It might confuse economic preferences with beliefs and values. We have beliefs about the way the environment should be, about the way we want the environment to be, and this gets merely reduced to economic preferences. I have an economic preference for this, and it treats political questions as consumer questions. And so we want to use economics as the framework for trying to resolve environmental problems, but environmental problems might resist that framework. There's a whole question of who or what counts, and really kind of who or what doesn't count. Who counts the most are the people who engage in more market behavior, typically people with more money. If you are poor, you count for less. If you are a non-human, you count for less or don't count at all, and you're only counted insofar as somebody commodifies you. The cost-benefit analysis way of evaluating environmental problems tends to overwhelm and replace other ways of evaluation, especially political and ethical evaluation. So again, this reduces environmental problems simply to economic problems. And economism actually rests on a view of human nature, kind of the view of human nature that is the ideal view for economics, that we're fundamentally rational preference maximizers. And that isn't always true. That does not necessarily describe who we are. And again, I put these problems up here for possible discussion later. And it treats the environment as nothing more than a scarce resource, and it tends to miss all other kinds of ties that we have to the environment, such as political ties, cultural ties, symbolic ties, ethical ties, and the like. And it reduces Homo sapiens to a new form of life we might call Homo economicus. And that's all I have. Thank you.
So this is great that Mark introduced us this way, because I think part of what you're going to see today is this dichotomy in the rational presentation of scientific facts versus his world of alternative facts. So what I want to do today is weave three stories together. One is to talk about how the scientists view facts, and I'm going to use real facts, which is kind of sad that I have to use a modifier for the word facts, but I will. And then we're going to talk about the world of alternative facts, and then what I'm going to try to point out together is how can we bridge that gap? How can scientists learn to be the better types of communicators who can get across this divide of just the rational side of facts from the scientific perspective and this economic perspective and view that you get from the alternative fact. Now, sometimes when we think about climate change in San Diego, it's a little hard to feel the impacts of climate change. We are lucky that we have this great quality of life, these great iconic images. But if we pay attention to the world around us, we know that things are already changing in San Diego. Right? So for example, sea level rise combined with king tides leads to an event like this where you've got flooding. It's one of my favorite pictures because it's flooding at the La Jolla Beach and Tennis Club during a meeting for the Southwest Regional Climate Change Group on sea level rise. So they really got to see it firsthand as they're talking about it from the meeting perspective. What I want to do now, though, is set the framework for the science. What do we know? What are the facts? When someone asks me, do I believe in climate change, my answer is no. I know what's happening. I'm a scientist taking an objective perspective. It's not a belief perspective. It's an objective analysis using facts. So what are some of the key baseline facts? It's getting warmer. This is data from NASA that just came out. It shows the overall trend of increasing temperature, particularly in the last 50 years. And it points out, if you look at the top of the curve, 2016 was the warmest year on record. It beat out 2015, it beat out 2014, and that trend continues. The data are clear, the planet is warming. CO2 is going up. Again, a rapid rise in the last 50 or 60 years. 2016 was the first year that we spent the entire year over 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. So the CO2 and the other greenhouse gases are part and parcel of the forcing factors for this global warming and climate change that we're seeing. And a piece of evidence that is often not looked at with the same depth and in importance that it should is that 97% of climate experts agree that climate change is happening and that it's human caused. This is a lot. If you know any scientist, you're trained to be critical. You're trained to not believe in anything. You can't get 4 scientists to agree on where to go for lunch. We have thousands of scientists looking at the data and pointing out that all the different data sets clearly indicate that climate change is real, it's happening, and it's happening because of human activities. Now that's a simple way of presenting it in a thing that we know is very complex. So let's look at some of the complexities, and again, just look at the boxes. The center 2 are the science part, right? The climate change processes of greenhouse gases and global warming, the climate features that we can see, that is glaciers melting and changes in circulation. But I want you to point out that the 2 biggest boxes on either side are how humans fit in. On one side, the human activities that lead to some of the changes, deforestation, fossil fuel burning, land use changes. And on the other side, the impacts to humans from climate change, from famine to casualties to economic losses to environmental refugees. And you might think, well, I've heard about some of the environmental refugees in other countries. They're in the United States. There are people in Louisiana today that have lost where they live because their islands are now gone. So it's not just a global issue, it's a national issue, it's a local issue. It's also a global issue when you look at these patterns. Extreme heat in Australia, where they actually have to come up with a new color on their color scheme because they didn't have temperatures ever that high before. Floods, droughts, infrastructure being affected by large waves. These are actual facts that really say tell the story from a scientific perspective. But where scientists go wrong is how they tell their story, or maybe I should say how they don't tell their story. Because we live in a world of facts, and therefore we present a very rational, fact-based, use your brain and come up. So we give you lots of data. We give you data from now and projections of temperature in the future and precipitation. We give you more data with really complicated explanations. We give you data with, make sure we have the uncertainty in there to make sure we tell you, we've carefully thought about this. We're not trying to hide anything. We give you more data and more complicated data and jargon that goes with this data. So we just pound data. That's what we give you because that's what works for us. From a scientific perspective, the training is to give you data, and you're going to believe us because we give you data, and you should trust the scientists. That's one of the things that's happening that's a little bit different in the world today, right? And we give you graphs that show anomalies. And by the way, we do all our data in the metric system. And of course, everybody in the United States understands the metric system. Most importantly, do our leaders and business leaders and presidents and cabinet members do it? No, but we work in that space, so we talk in that space. And that's one of the things we need to change. So what happens? We say, okay, we'll use infographics. We'll use projections. We'll use infographics. That'll work, but then we give you 6,000 infographics. And it's also too much. So what happens? They're frustrated. Scientists get frustrated. And then they use 3 techniques. They talk really loud and very slowly, and they repeat. Because that's what you do, just like going to a foreign country and speaking English when they don't speak English in that country. No, then they'll dumb it down. But that unfortunately insults your intelligence. We can simplify it, but if we start talking about terminology that's not right, especially if we're talking to cabinet members, politicians, business leaders, they are intelligent, well-educated people. It's not the way to go. Or we get so upset with the contrarians that we give up. This doesn't work. But it's because we're living in the world of facts, and we think facts will work. What's even worse in our current situation is we're trying to drive home the story with facts in a political landscape that is not based on facts. Right? We hear statements like this: climate change is a hoax. There's a book. Now the second half I couldn't resist, right? Sea levels are rising because Jesus is crying. And as much as that sounds funny, I will tell you that decisions are being made in Congress, in the Senate, in the House, in state governors, in attorney generals, using biblical principles to decide that climate change isn't happening. God would not do that to us. So now I've shifted from a rational, fact-based perspective to a belief perspective. And that's a very difficult battle because we're battling from the head to the heart. And we have to find a way to connect those two. So what's happening in the current political landscape? Scott Pruitt, Director of EPA, among many of the things he said, including that CO2 is not the cause of global warming, points out that scientists continue to disagree. We don't. That to the degree and extent of global warming, we don't. And that there's no real connection to mankind. Not true. So we should continue discussing this. But how can we discuss this if the facts don't show that? What we do is we have alternative facts. We use different things. We use different experts. Myron Ebel, who was the consultant for the EPA for President Trump and many others, says very proudly in every interview I do when I'm asked about scientific issues, I say I'm not a climate scientist, I'm just giving you an informed layman's perspective. His degree, sorry Brian, is in philosophy, but his master's degree is in economics. He's using the new form of perspectives. He attacks science, he attacks scientists, scientific method, but he's not coming from a scientific perspective. Greg Itzo, who is a self-proclaimed climate expert, and is the chairman of the Center for Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change. His father is the president, and his brother is the vice president of the Center for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change. Says CO2 is no longer not a pollutant, but is in fact the elixir of life, and is actually very good for the planet, and has actually said that Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si is an egregious attack on poor people because he's saying climate change is real, and he's really not taking into account that with more CO2, there's more plants, and we can feed the poor. Also has a whole article on connecting what's in the Bible to what's going on with CO2 on the planet currently. Right? So what happens when they try to get this to the people? They're very systematic. So I'm bringing this up as my prop. The scientists in the room will recognize this. We all have this in our mailbox. We go, this nice white, nondescript envelope, return address, but it doesn't say from who. And then there's a statement that says, the New York Times, ExxonMobil investigated for possible climate change lies by the New York Attorney General. So we figured there might be something good in there. And what it is volume 5, second edition of Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming, in a series called Climate Change Reconsidered by the non-governmental International Panel on Climate Change, a self-described group that works with the Heartland Institute, an institute that clearly does everything, including their own climate change conference, to use alternative facts. And I need to tell you, they're good. The work in here uses science, it just uses it in a way that is incorrect. They change the scales, they change the graph, they erase some of the data occasionally. Right? They do this consistently, and their approach is all about economics. It's about free markets, it's about free choice. It's about all these things that are not related to science. It's about beliefs, right, and economics. And then you get some really very, very insidious specific things. So on the right is a report from the U.S. Global Change Research Program, required by Congress to do a report every 5 years, starting in the Clinton administration. There was a break for 8 years, from 2000 to 2008. Don't know how that happened. And then there was 2 others. On the left is the addendum. Okay, now, Notice the fonts are the same, the colors are the same, a couple of things are different. At the bottom of this one is the temperature graph from 1800s to 2012, showing you the anomalies and showing the global warming very clearly in red. And the one on the left doesn't quite look the same, and that's because they use a slightly different data set. They only use 20 years. They started at the warmest year on record, and then it looks like there's no climate change. Now, they did not call it a rebuttal. I want you to be very clear. They called it an addendum. The entire report is written, same organization, same paragraphs, same arrangements, and it talks about all the things the scientists forgot to tell you about, and adds new information that's not correct, and redoes the graphs using incorrect data. This is done by the Cato Institute, another group that looks at it from an economic perspective. Again, what we have is a combination of science that's being now used by the non-scientists to go to, and I use their words, to war with climate science. So what do we have? We have a situation where the science is telling us that this is happening. We see it, we feel it, yet the dynamics show that there's a big push on the other side. And when I say the other side, this is the group, by the way, that influences decisions. So these are the chair of the Science and Technology Committee in the House, Lamar Smith, speaks at their conferences and brings 3 or 4 scientists out of thousands that don't believe in climate change to his events. Ted Cruz did the same thing before the election. Jim Inhofe, who was the chair of the Senate's version, they are bringing the same 3 or 4 scientists. It's always 3 to 1, by the way. They bring 1 climate scientist in the room, who usually gets attacked and cut off from some of his answers. This is systematic. So what can we do? How do we get across this? We need to improve our climate change literacy, and we need to be better communicators. The message here is, how do we do that? Several groups have been doing it for the last decade or so. I'm going to focus on the NSF-funded Climate Change Education Partnership. These are the 6 grants that have been funded for the last 7 years to come up with new ways to communicate climate change to different audiences, zoos, aquariums, K through 12. And I'm going to finish by telling us this last bit of the story, which is our group, Climate Education Partners here at USD. The first thing to point out is that in order to have a successful team that talks about this, you need an interdisciplinary approach. So we have faculty like John Yin, myself, and a colleague in EPIC from the University of San Diego looking at not only scientists, but science educators. The communication of science is done differently. We have behavioral psychologists from Cal State San Marcos and UCSF. We have high-end climate change research at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. We have partners in the community that work directly with leaders. And we have a professional strategic communication person, so we actually communicate in a way that's very specific. You may not have noticed this, but all the colors of my slides match, including my shirt. Every time I talk about climate change, I wear blue, teal, or green. Everything is thought out in our messaging. My water bottle, matches everything we do. We have a plan to get this done, get this across. But how do we know it's going to work? First, we need to know what our audience wants to hear and what they know. You'll be surprised to find that 85% of San Diegans say they are somewhat concerned about climate change. I want to point out that you may not know this, but San Diego is a conservative area. To have this much more than the national average tells us that San Diegans are concerned. In fact, 61% of San Diegans say that it's human caused, which is 14% above the national average. Right? What are they most concerned about? Future generations. This is something that cuts across political lines, racial lines, gender lines. Everybody cares about the planet being a place for future generations. Most importantly in this discussion about economics and science is that in San Diego County, we view, over 3/4 of people think we can have both a strong economy and a healthy environment. And in fact, this is a place for future growth in the economy rather than choosing one or the other. And maybe most importantly for our group, since we're working with decision makers, is we got to interview 150 of the who's who of San Diego, all across the board, community leaders, tribal leaders, business leaders, political people from different local, state, and national. 90% of them are concerned about climate change. That was the good news. If you notice the second part of the slide, however, only 10% think their peers are concerned. So therefore, we had to find a way to bridge that divide. And so we did a variety of different things. Some things we did is one-on-one discussions. I got to meet with port commissioners when they were coming up with their climate action plan. Talk to them one-on-one. They had a chance to actually talk to a scientist and discuss what's going on. We showed that San Diego County is a role model nationally With all the cities having greenhouse gas inventories, more than half of the climate action plan, San Diego with the most aggressive city climate plan in the country. The city of Chula Vista won a national award. The Port of San Diego won a national award. USD and other universities are involved. We have a climate collaborative. We have a lot of things going on, which means you want to be part of this community that's dealing with the climate change. So we created a resource called San Diego 2050. It was written and put together by scientists and social psychologists and communication experts. It was designed to talk to the leaders. And it was done different from everything that had been out before. First, we did the science being local and regional. That affects you, you see it, you feel it, you can know what's happening. So we don't talk about polar bears, we talk about Julian. We talk about San Diego County. Right? We used infographics, so we did simplify the science. We used the background to create a messaging that could be read by someone who's intelligent, who can look at it without dumbing it down. We made sure that it connected how people learn. Things I can do, things that's part of who I am, maybe more importantly, it's part of your deep values to do something about it. And our target was key influentials. Business leaders, elected officials, community leaders, faith-based leaders, tribal leaders. They are going to make a difference, they're going to make a difference in the short term. And most importantly, there's a message of hope and some solutions. The one thing also scientists tend to do with all the facts is it's really sad. It's kind of depressing that everything is going badly. We need to find a way to get people engaged, and we therefore need to connect their brain to their heart and get things moving from that perspective. We focused on leaders. If you're from San Diego, you recognize most of these people. You also recognize that at least half of those people are Republicans. This is an issue that should not be on one side of the aisle or the other. Everybody should be concerned about climate change. And we want to make sure that our messengers, our ambassadors, come from both sides of the political spectrum. Our report is designed to have science on one side, a year's worth of work to simplify high-end science to 3 or 4 bullet points, because that's what you're going to remember, to some simple infographics that get the message across. Balanced by statements directly from leaders to leaders. In this case, for water, San Diego County Water Authority and the Farmers Bureau, people who have impacts and see the impacts of water and the impacts of climate change. When we focus on the impacts, we focus on the driver, which is heat and precipitation, and the impacts that affect us locally: water, coastal flooding, wildfires, nature's benefit, and health. So let me just show you a couple of examples to tell you how the story has been told. When we talk about temperature, we use a simple graphic to open the conversation, pointing out that it's going to be, on average, almost 5 degrees warmer in 30 years. By the way, it's in degrees Fahrenheit, because that's the message that gets across to the people who are reading this information. So we can use that technique to get our message across. If they want to talk to me more, we can talk about all the degrees centigrade you want. But I need to get into the door first. When we talk about precipitation, we point out that we expect to be 16% less rain in the last 30 years than we have now, but 8% more floods. I'll remind those of you who were around in July of 2015, on that weekend it rained 2 inches in San Diego County, 4 inches in Ramona. Those 2 inches in that weekend were the equivalent amount of rain of the previous 100 years combined. This is what we mean by these unusual flood and rain events occurring in an unusual way. We don't only talk about sea level rise, we talk about coastal flooding. We point to the fact that if you add sea level rise to king tides, to El Nino events, more and more of our infrastructure is going to be affected. We point out the things that you can see and feel and understand, both from your reasoning perspective and from your effective perspective as well. And finally, we give you a suite of solutions you can try. Things you can do personally, things your company can do, things your university can do to solve some of these issues we see with climate change. So, what we need to do in this world of alternative facts is to present the facts in a way that connects to people's brains to make those decisions, and to people's heart to see that they're actually feeling it, to bridge that gap between just economics and beliefs and just rational thought. The other way to do this is we have to do it together. We have to work across disciplines, we have to work across political lines, we have to work across as many of these different possibilities to work together to come up with these solutions, and we have to do it because we need a good planet for the rest of the future generations. Thanks.
Dead men walking. The reason I say this is I was recently talking to, I have quite a few colleagues in the EPA, and I asked them, what's it like there? Since January, things have changed a lot, and I kind of wondered, putting myself in their shoes, what would it be like to work in an agency with this kind of mission, and so many of them are very mission-driven. What would it be like to be in an agency right now in which the mission has been totally turned on its head? That you have somebody running the agency who used to sue the agency. You have somebody running the agency who has declared that they don't believe in the mission, or that the mission is now completely changed from what you're used to. Some of these people have been working there for 10, 20, 30 years. There was just a recent high-profile person, been there 30 years, quit, and had a lot of choice words for the administration going out the door. And really, you need no other evidence than the fact that there's an alternative EPA now. That enough people are disgruntled. Disgruntled is not the word. Can you imagine if some professors got together and formed an alternative USD, created a website, a Twitter account, Facebook, just to talk about how crummy the current leadership at USD is? That's how bad it is. That we are risking our jobs. That's what they're saying. But they know that they could be easily found out. I mean, in this day and age, with the tools of the federal government, sure, they can be discovered. But that's how bad it is. Many of them feel like dead men walking, so they have nothing to lose. Either personally, they think, I'm not going to be here that much longer, either I can't stand it, or I'm not the kind of person they're going to keep around, or they just feel like it's not worth it anyhow. If I had to stick around and keep my mouth shut, I just wouldn't do it. So I'll give this a try. I'll speak out. I'll try to stay in it. Why did they stay? They have two very bad choices. They either stay and take part in something they for the most part, deeply just don't believe in, which is the current leadership, the current administration from Pruitt all the way up to Trump, or they leave and they help the administration gut the agency. As we saw, and I've got a whole slide just because I thought it would be shock and awe, but we've already had the shock and awe of all the executive orders. Some of them are explicitly about the environment, but some of them are more generally about gutting the government. And those include things like hiring freezes, freezing new programs and new spending. The one in, two out policy, for every new regulation you get rid of two. So if you leave, you're just helping that part along. You know you can't be replaced, there's a hiring freeze. You know whatever program you were working on, if enough people leave, you just get rid of that. There you go, that's your two out. Yeah, that program, whatever she was working on, get rid of that, she just left. So you have these very bad choices. You hang on because you're going to try to work from the inside. It's the ultimate idea of being in the belly of the beast and trying to fight from the inside, being undercover, so to speak. But you have to be kind of implicitly involved in regressive policies then. You can only do so much. And if you do too much, you're going to get fired. So you can imagine this is a very uncomfortable time for a lot of people who have really given their lives to this mission. And you see this as this idea of utter hopelessness. Really, it's been, the people I have spoken to independently have said, it feels like a funeral in here every day. It's either dark humor or just morose, sort of shuffling around, going about your business, or diving deep into the details. You really have to convince yourself that the sort of detailed work you're doing, especially if you're a scientist, maybe there's a sense of the monks of the Dark Ages, furiously scrawling and transferring information because it's all going downhill. It's all lost. But I can play my role, and you see this in the alternative EPA website. The way they describe themselves is a repository for scientific data. In the very final days of the transition of power, a lot of people at the EPA were furiously thumb drives out, getting everything they could, illegally in some cases, to make sure it wasn't going to all go away. So I often think about this analogy of they're like monks trying to save all the knowledge as the world gets darker and darker. We are, at least by some accounts, getting darker. The knowledge is getting dimmer, our understanding is receding. We're no longer as driven by compassion. We are driven more and more seemingly by sort of this purely economic reasoning, which is short-term reasoning. I'll stick to the topic here, but I would point out that most economists think that this reasoning does not pan out in the long term. It's purely short term. That the destruction brought on by things like climate change, even by purely economic reasoning, forgetting the values, forgetting whether we care about an individual species or the existence of the rainforest, all of that, forget all that. We just care about the pure market value of things. It doesn't make sense once you get past a short time horizon of maybe 10 years or 20 years. But for politicians and for business leaders, that is the time horizon. For politicians especially, they're just going to care about what's going to happen in their next election for the most part, except for the most principled ones. And for business leaders, they care about the next shareholders report. So, we have this agency that's supposed to be there as the bulwark against this short-term thinking. The EPA, just in case, I know most of you are probably familiar, it was the Nixon administration. I mean, this is landmark Nixon stuff, right? The EPA, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. So this by no means was this a highly politicized issue until the late 80s and the 90s, and there's a whole story behind that would take far too much time, but suffice it to say that things changed quite a bit. And we went from the early 90s when carbon markets were seen as the conservative market-based approach to climate change to now climate change doesn't exist and carbon markets are a left-wing mechanism. So things have changed quite a bit, but this agency was always there for us. And really for us, when we talk about what is the ism that the EPA is supposed to be about, it is human-centric. It's there to protect human health. It's not there to protect the environment per se. It's there to protect the environment for the betterment of human health. And that's why everything the EPA does has to be justified through human health concerns. So for example, in 2007, when a bunch of states, led by Massachusetts versus the EPA, sued the EPA for not regulating carbon dioxide, they had to prove that climate change would hurt people in Massachusetts. They had to connect the dots between stuff that's coming out of the tailpipes of our cars and factories, going up into the atmosphere, doing all this very difficult to explain to the average person stuff, all these scientific processes, that somehow changes the climate, which affects sea level rise, which floods Massachusetts, which puts people in danger. That was how they had to connect the dots, and they prevailed. So in theory, there is good law saying that the EPA has to regulate carbon dioxide, but only because of human health. Not because of a species in South America, not because we're going to lose some really important ecosystem. None of that. Not because planet Earth, because of humans. Nevertheless, a lot of these people do believe pretty strongly in the environment for the environment's sake and human health. They always believe that these things can go together. And now they're taking part in an organization that no longer has the mission that they've committed their lives to. I want to point out here, even if you care about economics, the impact on the EPA, just from the purely economic, from an administration that says it cares about jobs, it's pretty staggering. 3,200 jobs cut under the proposed budget. More than 20% of the agency's workforce. Now the interesting reaction when pushed on this, a lot of Pruitt and Tirrell and Trump have said things like, hey, you know what? These are the right kinds of jobs to lose. Basically, they make it into a job war. Wouldn't we rather that coal miners have jobs and these people don't? So they made it into this zero-sum game. Instead of thinking, hey, jobs lost are a bad thing. We should try to find a way to increase jobs for everyone. They've made this they've drawn those lines, those battle lines, and say, well, for every job lost here, the theory is we can create a job mining coal. I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to speculate, but I've seen very little evidence, and I haven't heard many say that coal is realistically coming back. The market forces don't seem to be there. I'll leave it to economists to talk about, but that's at least the theory. The current hiring freeze means that there's no replacements when somebody leaves. And that's part of the strategy. The hiring freeze isn't really about not bringing on new people. The hope is that people will leave and then they won't be replaced. So the idea here is truly, and it's not unique to the EPA, but it's truly a gutting of the federal government, but it's kind of a slow bleed rather than a swift action. It's really taking away, between freezing hiring and freezing new projects, taking away the ability for the agency to maintain its current size and scope of activity. And eliminating very popular programs. Energy Star, I mean, that's something that probably everyone's seen on the appliances they buy. This is not at all a partisan thing. I've never ever heard, and it's like so many things that are coming up now, I've never heard anyone say, you know what, we really need to get rid of the Energy Star program. But indeed, that's on the cutting block. Environmental justice, and you can imagine, given what all the other things that are happening in the administration, why environmental justice is on the cutting block. And of course, the clean power programs that are maybe the most famous and most recently under attack by executive order. Basically all these climate change steps that are meant to take us into the moving forward with the Paris Agreement, which we'll talk about in a moment. What I noticed when the budget was brought up, and this, of course, like so many things, is perhaps hard to read, but the very bottom one, and the things in the red are the things that were proposed to be cut, the very bottom one is the EPA. And believe me, I was horrified to find out Meals on Wheels was being cut too. But that seemed to be the one that really caught fire, because you have this vision of, you know, our oldest generation, you know, starving, and we're going to let them starve. And I understand why that's such a powerful image. There was relatively little talk about the EPA, even though it was by far the one that was nearly a third of the budget to be cut. And I saw relatively little discussion of it. The other big thing was the State Department and development aid, which has a lot to do with the environment as well. A lot of the climate adaptation that will be going on in other countries, basically attempts to not stop climate change, but to adapt to it, to help people deal with the flooding and with droughts, was coming through the State Department. So when you look at this budget, which seems like it's just for some people at least, just a fiscally conservative cutting back, the environment is really targeted in a major way here, led by the EPA. Again, I was shocked at how little discussion of that, and this is a big part of why people within the EPA are so pessimistic right now. Because it's pretty clear when you look at this budget and when you look at the personnel, not just in the EPA itself, but Secretary of State coming from big oil. When you look at just the overall personnel of the administration right now, the environment seems to be particularly under attack. And it's not the thing that people are talking about the most. And that's because there are so many things that people are concerned about right now. It's not clear what we should be focused on. I think a lot of people are overwhelmed. Every day it seems like there's something new, at least for many people, to focus on. But the EPA and the environment specifically has been targeted. It's the same list of executive orders. Just to see them listed out, this is in the first 100 days. This is a lot. This is a lot of activity for an entire presidential term, let alone 100 days. And I left some out because I didn't want to overwhelm. But it's pretty incredible. So we come to the Paris Agreement, and the EPA is the agency, it's the part of the federal government that is supposed to be implementing everything we do. The State Department negotiates the Paris Agreement, but when the rubber hits the road, it's the EPA that's going to implement it within the United States. And really, it's there to take whatever law is made, whatever treaties are signed, whatever international agreements there are, and bring them to bear on the United States itself. And when you have the leader of the EPA saying, it's a bad deal for America, it was an America's second, third, or fourth kind of approach. China and India has no obligations. That's his wording, not mine. China and India has no obligations under the agreement until 2030. We front-loaded all our costs. First of all, that's not true. But even if it were true, it's fairly disturbing to have somebody who's supposed to be leading the EPA, who's supposed to be leading the charge to do something about climate change, saying it's a bad deal. And the only positive we can see out of all of this is that finally we've seen the big oil companies say, hey, look, we need some kind of agreement. Even they can't ignore the risk involved in doing nothing about climate change. Even they can't ignore the fact that economically, long-term, it's devastating. And Tillerson saying, well, we're better served by being at that table, but then by leaving it. Exxon, Royal Dutch Shell, BP, they all have endorsed the pact. And what we don't know is what Trump will do. He hasn't said yet what he plans to do with the Paris Agreement. It is disturbing that what Pruitt said. But what we do know is who's taking up the international mantle. Already the EU has been, assuming it's going to exist in the next 20 years, the EU has been the one leading the charge. We had an agreement in 1997 coming out of Kyoto, and the EU has, for the most part, fulfilled many of its obligations, has been the leader in fulfilling those obligations. Of course, that's an agreement that the US backed out of under the Bush administration. But the EU never really had the power to do it all on its own. What we're seeing now, and I guess I'm going to present this as, regardless of what you think about climate change, from an American perspective, we are handing a lot of power to other countries, and China in particular has taken up the mantle. There's a fairly important agreement before the Paris Agreement, and just to be clear, the Paris Agreement was a big international agreement to do something about climate change, to set standards, and for each country to set its own goals to make sure climate change is mitigated. The United States and China had a fairly strong agreement that allowed the Paris Accord to happen. China has said, we're going to continue on with that, with or without the US. A lot of the world has said, we're continuing on. And from a very short-term perspective, Americans might cheer and say, hey, we don't have to do anything. We can be free riders. We can just let the rest of the world try to take care of this. But from a broader perspective, this is pretty bad news for the US. This means that we're losing leadership. We've given away a role that Obama kind of saved for us in a sense, because we were known as sort of the climate bad guys along with China. And in that, coming to that agreement, Obama sort of elevated us back into the picture as a climate leader. And now we're sort of willingly handing that off. That has repercussions that go far beyond climate change and far beyond the environment. There is a certain amount of respect that we are ceding with this and other recent activities. And there's a role in the world that we're giving up. The one thing I can say, I'm going to try to leave with a little hope, is that we have states and cities, in addition to the private sector, in addition to the markets, and there's obviously there are lots of potential outcomes that are, can help mitigate the losses from, if we were to pull out of this agreement. We have a lot of activity with states and cities, and we've heard a little bit about San Diego. Recently, California and Scotland, I don't know if you saw this in the news, signed their own private agreement. So we're seeing subnational entities like states come together and try to, as they put it, capitalize on the potential of the the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding. Basically, this is an agreement that covers a huge portion of the world that says, hey, look, we as lesser than states, as entities that are below the state level, are going to come together and have our own agreement. We don't need to wait for national governments to come together. And they've committed to cutting greenhouse gases emissions by 80 to 95% below 1990 levels. I mean, that's a huge step. That's by the year 2050. It's a huge step, and it's at the same time exactly what we need to do. Even the best case scenario, or the most lenient scenario, has us cutting by 80% by 2050 to get anywhere close to what we need to avoid cataclysmic climate change results. But still, I don't have a hopeful tone, I guess. Maybe I need to work on that. It's hard to, in preparing this, I'll say on a personal note, in preparing this, it's hard to look at all of this. I think a lot of us have been in the state of knowing but not looking for the last few months. Knowing that terrible things are happening but not wanting to sit with it. Because it's a hard thing to sit with. Especially after a moment last year or 2 years ago where we had a pretty big breakthrough. It seemed like we were finally going to turn the corner around climate change. It seemed like the EPA was finally bringing in some much needed structure to what we were doing. It's a tough time, but I think it calls, in a sense, I position just now what China's doing as maybe bad news for the US, but it's good news for the world. And I find myself increasingly thinking, there are lots of criticisms to make about China, but man, I'm really happy that China is at somebody, whether it's China or the US. I wish it were the US and I wish it were everyone, but there's good news that perhaps the world is reacting and waking up. We have cities waking up, we have states waking up, we have China taking steps forward, we have the rest of the world saying we're ready to step on without the US. We have private companies, including big oil companies, saying, hey, we have to do something. So if anything, like so many other issues right now, it's been a moment of waking up. It's been a moment of people being sort of shocked out of complacency and saying, hey, if we're not going to have the leadership from the administration, from the federal government of the U.S., other people are ready to step into that role. So I think the positive thing here is, despite the EPA, it's all bad news. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. There's nothing good to be said about what's going on in the EPA right now, but the good news is the response to the gutting of the EPA has been really positive. We've seen a lot of new entities step into that, those needed positions of power and willingness to make some major moves. So I guess that's the most hopeful thing I can give you. The stuff with the EPA is, it's pure depressing. It's been a purely depressing thing to gather this all together. But hopefully we can have a good conversation now and talk about the ways forward.
Floor is open for questions. Hugh.
I do want to say, Michel, that I appreciate the fact that you've got a whole new way of providing a message that's more accessible to people and is even color-coded. And I thought you should have given a little credit to Brian Clack for painting the ceiling to match your...
I missed that, sir.
I want to take issue with something Andy said that I think historically we need to correct. You had started by talking about sort of the way we've approached the environment in a bilateral kind of way, Republicans and Democrats. And what I notice is that as the years go by, the stature of Richard Nixon increases immensely as we forget everything else. And one of the things we may have forgotten is that Richard Nixon was never in favor of clean air. He was never in favor of clean water. He was never in favor of endangered species. He lived at a time when there was huge mobilization of people. There was a very large environmental movement that had built on the shoulders of a pre-existing anti-war movement, a women's liberation movement, which had built on the shoulders of a civil rights movement, and there was a huge amount of mobilization. What you got in those laws were veto-proof majorities that were passing them, and so he accepted those. And now, because it happened while he was president, it is the Nixon administration's contribution to the environment, and it's just not the case.
I agree with you 100%. I think what's happening now, it's not so much that people are reconsidering Nixon, although that might be the unintended consequence. It's an attempt to undo this idea, this identity connection between the environment and a political party. Because so many people are identity driven about their party. We see this with the number of people who are willing to reassess Trump. As a lot of never Trumpers, as soon as it was clear he would be the Republican candidate, they could make it work. They could focus on what they needed to, whether it was the Supreme Court or any other policy that was important to them, because we are very strongly wedded to our parties. And so I agree with you. I think it is a bit, and it's maybe a dangerous sleight of hand. The idea is to try to connect these things with the Republican president in order to point out that this was never as divisive as it is today. I do think it's true that it wasn't as divisive at the time. The other thing that's forgotten is at the time there was so much ample evidence of how bad things were. Just rivers that were disgusting.
On fire.
Yeah, on fire, literally. Air that was unbreathable, smog that was suffocating. That also meant that I agree with you, a lot of it was the movement and the pressure behind it, but the other thing was it was hard to stand there and deny that there was a problem. It was very hard to say, hey, you know what, the environment's just fine. But you're right, and perhaps it's dangerous because it sort of undercuts the real, the movements that were behind this. And maybe it would be more instructive to say, we were once in a time when things were pretty bad and pretty dark, and we had movements that helped us out of it. So maybe that can be instructive for us now. I agree with you.
Part of the way I've couched it is that, and as it should be, having clean air, having clean water, having an environment that we can all live in should not be a partisan issue. And part of what the story there is that it was a bipartisan, regardless if Nixon himself was an environmentalist, which he was not. It was a bipartisan effort. More and more now, the divide is there. Some of the psychology papers coming out of how people are dealing with climate change data. There was a great study done in Australia, but comparing Australia to the US, and they showed evidence. The more evidence they showed, look to see how people responded. In Australia, if you were equivalent of a Democrat and you got more evidence, you became more convinced climate change was happening. And if you were a Republican equivalent, you also began to believe that climate change was happening. In the US, the same data set showed that the Democrats became more convinced and the Republicans became less convinced. In fact, it was called the backfire effect. The more objective scientific evidence they were given, the more they chose their ideology over the objectivity. And that's, I think, what's changed since the 70s to now, is that having a connection to clean water, clean air, and a good environment has become a partisan issue. And I've said this to some of my students, if I read to you some of the comments that have been said about our project, and have been said about me personally, and about some of my colleagues, it's really quite depressing. I mean, I'm destroying the fabric of America, one of my favorites. I'm worse than ISIS. I mean, another one of my favorites. I mean, these are things that are said because we're talking about climate change, and that should not be the kinds of comments that come out when you're talking about objective data. If you read the paper, they always make sure they bring somebody from the Heartland Institute in every single story. On Sunday, they had a paper about the March for Science and activism in the science and climate change, and there's 3 columns about all the good things scientists have done, and 1 column from, well, maybe we scientists shouldn't be involved, and it's all the left that are on the side of doing the right things for science. So I think that, to me, is what needs to change, is the conversation needs to be coming that all of us should be concerned regardless of who we vote for.
Is there any kind of concerted effort to go to court? Because to me, that's the way you deal with Donald Trump, in court. I'm talking about the different environmental organizations. Is there any concerted legal action plan?
First court case for the wall was filed by the Center for Biodiversity. They just submitted because they want the wall is going to affect biodiversity impacts, and so they actually did go through the courts, or at least they're trying to go through the courts for that one. I find it ironic that Scott Pruitt is suing himself right now. He's got 8 suits against the EPA, and he hasn't dropped them, which is really weird. So I guess he's going to win and lose simultaneously. I do think the courts are a way to go, but the problem with that is the time it takes to go through the court. The lawyer can answer that question. The time it takes to go through that will potentially be too late by then.
We also have to have standing. This is a problem. That means you have to be in a position where the law recognizes you as somebody who can bring suit. And so when you have endangered species, you have a specific law that has said you can bring this to court. But there are lots of actions that, as I explained in the Massachusetts case, it's really hard to connect those dots. You have to show that human health is being affected, and not just some human's health. The person bringing the suit has to be the one who's being affected. So it's difficult. It's difficult to find, especially executive actions. It's not really easy. Those are just pronouncements, and then we have to wait for an agency to do something. Then you have to sue the agency and basically say, you are breaking some law. The environment doesn't have rights, not in the US. There are a couple of places that have experimented with that. People have rights. And you have to show that your rights are being violated under some relevant law. It's not as straightforward as it might sound, and it does take years and years. And then you always have the problem of if a court renders a decision, who's the one who implements that decision? The executive branch. So you can always have the executive branch either drag its feet. I mean, one reason why I said Massachusetts versus the EPA 2007, why did that one work out? That's what led to our higher miles per gallon for cars ratings, because the next administration came in. The old administration dragged its feet and did nothing. They said, oh yeah, we're going to get around to that in 20 years. The Obama administration came in and recognized this ruling and started working on it. It's very hard to make an administration do something that it doesn't want to do. So, it may be in a very clear case, but it's not like this is a strategy that could work across the board.
So, since we're in kind of more of a bipartisan political climate right now, how would you say is the best physical motion at a personal level to get through to someone who has a different ideology than you, as i.e. like Republicans, if you can't give them the data, like Michel is saying, and like what is the best way to do that, especially with the March for Science coming up? How are we going to create that as not just a democratic protest against the government, rather than a uniform, there's both Republicans and Democrats marching together? How is that going to be the best portrayed message?
Well, I mean, one thing both Michelle and Andy talked about, economics. I mean, this is certainly the economism I presented is very much a short-term perspective. And the kinds of changes that the Trump administration is proposing don't make sense economically in the long term. And so one way to go about this is to turn economism on its head and use economics arguments in order to show what needs to be done.
As an example, when I talked to the port commissioner, who was a businessman, we didn't talk about data for a while. We talked about how actually we collect data as scientists, and he was a real estate person. And I said, so you use 2-3 year trends to make real estate decisions? He goes, oh, of course not. I use 20 and 30 years worth of data on my real estate decisions. And I go, that's good, so do we. And it was the first time he thought about the fact that we analyze things the same way. And he had to make an important decision, because if he approved the climate action plan, that's millions of dollars that the port has to spend. So the discussion had to be about economics. It had to be about how things work. I think the other reason why our project has chosen to work on decision makers and has used decision makers as ambassadors is that you have a peer-to-peer connection. There are times in which, despite our best communication tools, we're still viewed as scientists. I walk in a room, and if I'm in a room with people who are primarily on the right politically, I'm already pigeonholed as the tree hugger. It doesn't matter what I say and how I present myself or what color shirt I'm wearing. So that's one of the reasons why we've tried to get messengers that are peer-to-peer. If a Republican governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, pushes climate change things, the state moves on. He was not using a ideological perspective. He was using its right for the state of California perspective. So I think that's part of it. When you're talking about your peers, that's a bit of a difficult perspective. There are times in which if they're so ideologically locked in, it's not worth it. It really is not going to go anywhere. And we've run into people who simply will not move away from their ideology. And there's about 10 to 15% of the country that sits in that window. And the 6 projects working together have basically decided to ignore working with them. We need to move the middle people who aren't sure, who can potentially get information and make the right decisions, because we can spend 80% of our time trying to convince the 10 people out of 100 that are never going to change their perspective. So it's a combination of those things.
I find it entirely plausible. There's people that agree with the climate change science and are on board that it's happening, humans are causing it, but they might disagree with the best ways to mitigate it, or they might not find it worthwhile to even, maybe they want to spend it in education or healthcare another way, or maybe they agree that the role of government isn't best spent in more regulations and whatnot. What would you say to those people, and have you had those conversations?
I think I would say, and this came up in a sort of a famous, the government of the UK actually commissioned a report on the long-term consequences of climate change called the Stern Report. And this became an economics argument because Stern said, long-term, you're going to help the most people dealing with climate change right now. But another economist said, how can you say that when you can save people from hunger today? And the assumption there is this, again, the zero-sum game. You either do climate change or you help people. So the first thing I'd say is, there's no reason why this connection between you either do the economy or you do climate change is a false one, I believe.
It is.
And on top of that, even if you can't get that argument to land, it's pretty clear that unless you value human lives now more than human lives in the future, climate change is this existential threat, and there is all kinds of evidence that it's going to be really bad if it goes unmitigated in a way that, in some ways, when there's error, when there's huge amounts of error, it turns out to be often worse than better. That is, scientists say, oh, we goofed up. It's actually going to be way worse than we originally thought, not way better.
The estimates are conservative.
We keep banking on it like we're going to discover something better. So I think there's all kinds of evidence that if we are leaning in in a direction that's not exactly correct, we're leaning the wrong way. So I think there's a good argument to be made that we better do something because it could be way worse than we ever imagined.
But as an example, right? So we build a convention center, they want to increase it.
pure economic arguments, we need to have a bigger convention center. But it's on the coast. So there could be 5 inches of sea level rise. There could be a foot, there could be 2, there could be 3. The building has to be built for 30 years. So you might say, well, I don't have to worry about it. I'm not going to do anything because I won't be here in 30 years. And so what if Comic-Con floods, right? But on the other hand, if you put the economic argument and say, but are you going to lose anything if you make this building better, more efficient? And so I think the argument has to come back to some of the things we talk about related to energy and sustainability and climate change are actually beneficial to us now. So the spending on it is not to defeat climate change. The spending actually is to make your life better now, and it turns out if you do it right, it's going to be better for a climate change perspective. So if we replace grass with California natives and use less water, the campus can still be beautiful, and we're using less water. So what if climate change doesn't happen? We've actually used less water for the last 5 years, and we're saving hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's a win-win regardless of the situation. And unfortunately, we don't often talk about that. We set it up as, I either do this or I do that. Look at San Diego. We have clean tech. We have blue tech. We're leading the nation in jobs related to alternative energy. That's a good thing. And if climate change doesn't affect us, we're still leading the nation in jobs in alternative energy, which is a positive thing. So I think that's where we need to start having those conversations.
And you can think about that on the level of individual technologies. So electric cars, for example, even if there's no climate change, would it not be nicer to have cars that are quieter, that don't put out other kinds of pollutants, that don't make children sick with asthma? So it's not, there are very few decisions where we are only doing something for climate change. Yep. There are many cases where they would have multiple benefits. Climate change is just but one of those benefits.
The universities around the United States, how can they play a role to educate the public in their states that what's, to the facts? And is there any kind of effort on a university level to educate the public, even in a coal mining state like West Virginia, that...
I'll take that one if you want.
Yeah, you take that one.
So we're part of a project that has 6 groups working on some of those issues. There were actually 15 at the beginning. It's very much state dependent. You can't have a national program because it very much depends on where you are. I'll give you an example. One of the projects that was funded in Kansas was working with farmers who are very much affected by impacts of climate change. They had $1 million project to talk to farmers and they couldn't use the word climate change. Right? So how do you educate them? The farmers knew about it. Farmers were doing something about it. They just could not use that word because that shut down the conversation. So part of these projects are looking at new ways to bring it into play. Universities are doing gaming, so learning how to, that's a big thing right now for college students. There's curriculum going on for kids to teach it. Doing it in zoos and aquariums. So they get the public engaged. We can't only do it at the university level. We tend to be in our little bubble in a university, and we can bring the public in, which is a great thing. But in order to really reach the most people, we have to try it in different ways. We have to do it at zoos and aquariums. We have to do it in community events. We have to do it for kids, because it turns out, as you may know, and those of you who are parents in the room, your kids will come in and tell you things that you may or may not want to hear. And so they're a major influencer. So they found, for example, that recycling increased when kids in school started learning recycling because they would shame their parents to say, you should be recycling this. You might not know this because you're the ones who are doing that to your parents, by the way. But these things have changed. So the message is, we can't have one message. We can't have a national plan. We have to go state by state. We have to find ways to do it in different places. And the short answer to your second question is, yes, there's some efforts going on. Unfortunately, there will be 0 federal dollars for anything resembling environmental anything. So we need to find private funders. We need to have people who believe that this is important. Corporations, wealthy individuals who say we need to support our country. Ironically, Make America Great Again should make us number 1. Then why shouldn't we be number 1 to lead the world in climate change, mitigation and adaptation and technology rather than dropping out of the race? And I think we need to turn the whole idea on its head. Wait, back there, someone new. Kenzie.
How do you think the Trump administration's attack on media outlets, specifically ones that tend to be liberal, has affected science's attempt to make scientific communication more accessible to the public?
I actually say I actually think these attacks have backfired a bit. The media's profile has been, I think, is stronger than it's been in a long time, generally. I think there's a group of people who buy into every attack, but I don't remember a time, we're at a point now where Dan Rather's a celebrity, right? We've actually made he was always a celebrity, but he's a celebrity now. He has a huge following personally. We are at a time now when media sources are still not trusted as much, but we are paying a lot more attention. So I like to think that there's a backfire happening right now, that people are more aware, at least in certain demographics, more aware than they've ever been. But I'll leave others to be more pessimistic about it.
So to this time, I'll be the pessimist. A study just came out on how many minutes were spent on climate change during the electoral process. And it's pathetic. It's something like less than 10 minutes for all the debates combined. And every news outlet except public broadcasting had a significant decrease in their coverage of environmental and climate change issues in the last year. Only KPBS increased their coverage. So that's part of what's happening, is a lot of the outlandish statements move the discussion. So you hear some crazy statement about immigration, so we talk about immigration for 3 or 4 days. And so what's happening, unfortunately, is there's less coverage going on, and that's one of the negative consequences of what's gone on in the wild, because there's so many other things going on. The other thing that's a problem is this fact, it's called media, it's a biased balance in the media, which is for every situation they talk about climate change, from a scientist, they bring a person from the Cato Institute or the Heartland Institute or the Heritage Foundation, and it's shown as a one-to-one. And if you want to see the best response to that, please go see the John Oliver show. I think it was his first one. Mm-hmm. And he points out that the debate, if it's 97-3, should not be 1-to-1. And the scientist defending it should not always be Bill Nye, even though he did a really nice job. So the media has an issue. There was a USD student who graduated, who was doing her master's in media, who called me up. She was doing a paper on the military and climate change. We had a lovely discussion, and I asked her, are you going to have to present a balanced perspective that it's not happening? And she said, yes, I'll fail my class if I do not put the fact that there's some people who don't believe in climate change, even though, by the way, the Pentagon views climate change as their number one security issue, more than ISIS, more than other things. Climate change is the number one security issue for the Pentagon. And yet she had to present a balanced perspective. That's the way it's done right now.
If you go back to internal memos in Shell, going back to the 1990s, they talk about climate change. Even Big Oil has internally admitted that this is happening. I agree. The coverage of the environment is atrocious. I think the attack on, it's not the attack on the media, though. I think this is self-inflicted wounds by the media. I don't think it's that Trump has attacked the media and the media has shied away from covering the environment. I think the media, even before Trump rose, you never hear about the environment in the news, ever. And I don't think it's a new thing. I think it has nothing to do with the attacks. I think the attacks have largely backfired, but we still have this problem that the media self-censors about the environment, whether it's presenting both sides when it's a one-sided issue or not talking about it at all. And you look in the debates, not mentioned nearly.
2 minutes.
Yeah, it's just, it's pathetic, and I don't think it's Trump. I think there's a it actually reminds me of what you found in your interviews. People think no one else cares.
Yep.
The media thinks that American people don't care, so they don't report on it. They think that American people care about missiles. And they might be right. And there's a lot of evidence that people pay attention when missiles are involved. But I think people would care more about the environment if the media were presenting it. I think it's all self-inflicted there. I don't think it's
Mark,
Trump.
you want the last word?
Yeah, there's a whole notion of what's called slow violence. And climate change is slow violence. And you have casualties that you do not see in the media. And the media will not report on climate change because it's not fashionable to report on that. It's not sexy. It's not like reporting on the latest terrorist attack.